I went to medical school at Georgetown. That's where I also discovered there is another side to the story. If I was going to be a pediatrician, I better learn about instead of just taking everything on faith. Every book was either very much against or very much in favor of. The world needed a balanced book that shows both sides of the story. Doctors get end-of-the-year incentives and bonuses for every fully patient they have. Hundreds of scientific articles that did show this was causing severe brain injury, and the government wasn't doing anything about it. That kind of pissed me off a little bit.
Do you think a lot of doctors might secretly agree with you if there wasn't such a tremendous blowback or professional risk?
Wow, interesting. I always wondered that.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Lila Rose Show. All right, we are going into unnavigated territory today on the show. I'm actually really excited about today's episode. We are tackling the question of vaccines. This is highly controversial, especially among some groups, but I think it's incredibly important because vaccines are everywhere. They're recommended for our children. We love and care for our children. We want them to be the healthiest that they can be. And so the big question is, what should we be thinking about the CDC's recommended schedule, which in some places, like the state of California, is required for kids to go to school. So we're going to deep dive this with a fantastic pediatrician and researcher, a doctor named Dr. Bob Sears. He wrote a book called The Book. Here it is. And we're going to explore the history of vaccines. We're going to talk about some specific the risks, the advantages. We're going to talk about the incentives that exist with pharmaceutical companies and doctors' offices and so much more. I think this episode will be incredibly informative and I hope you enjoy it. Please let me know what you think. I always love hearing from you. You can do that in the comments or you can email me at lila@gtbmedia.com. Dr. Bob Sears, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks, Lila. I appreciate you being brave enough to take on this topic.
I guess it does take some sort of bravery, but the bravery is all yours because you have done a huge service to parents. And not only as a pediatrician and you're serving, I know, hundreds of families, but in your work and writing the book and your published work, because it really is a service to give parents full information as a medical professional. So thank you.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Thank you for saying that. It needed to be done. I feel like there was no book of its kind back when I first wrote the first version in 2007. Every book was either very much against the vaccines or very much in favor of vaccines. And I feel like the world needed a balanced book that shows both sides of the story.
Well done. Well, I think you've definitely accomplished that. So thank you. And, you know, folks listening who haven't yet gotten familiar, they'll get familiar in this conversation with you and your work. But tell us a little bit about your background, Dr. Sears.
Well, I came from a family of eight kids. My dad is a pediatrician and my mom is a nurse, and they worked together in the office. And I actually remember running around his office up in Canada when I was a kid. And as I grew up, he told me he was giving me the freedom to choose to be any type of children's doctor that I wanted to be. And I don't know, maybe back in those days, our parents made us, go into their own fields.
How many of you kids are doctors?
There's 3 of us.
Out of 8.
Yeah.
That's
3
not
out
too
of
many.
8. Yeah. Yeah. So, I just was always drawn towards pediatrics. And I went to medical school at Georgetown and really fell in love with pediatrics there. And then that's where I also discovered there is another side to the story. And so I just kind of opened my eyes. If I was going to be a pediatrician, I better learn about instead of just, taking everything on faith and blindly following the mainstream medical policies on. I really wanted to know for myself what the truth was.
Where did you go to medical school?
At Georgetown
Awesome.
University in Washington, D.C.
Awesome. Yeah. And you mentioned one of 8 kids, which is great. I'm actually one of 8 kids too. So I love seeing fellow 8-kidder families. But your dad too has a pretty amazing, has done a lot of service to humanity with his writing and work as well.
Yes. Yeah. He really brought to the forefront the idea of an attached, involved style of parenting with your kids. versus maybe you're probably too young to remember the Dr. Spock days of raising kids in the 50s and the 60s, a very unattached way of raising kids. My dad really rewrote that book and made that very popular. And I think the world has really benefited from that.
Yeah. Dr. Bill Sears.
Yes. Yeah.
Before we get into obviously your work here, which is I'm very excited to jump into, I am curious being raised by Dr. Bill Sears, who, has had such it's not gentle parenting. He's not teaching gentle parenting. That's like the, IG phase word, Instagram, popular word. But it was, as you say, attached to parenting. And, he has such excellent advice, not just for the health of a child, but the emotional and disciplinary approach to a child. What was it like being raised in that household with Dr. Bill Sears, your mom, 7 siblings?
Yeah, well,
Canada.
I like to joke that my mom and dad didn't figure any of this out until their 4th child.
Okay. What number are you?
I'm number 2. So,
okay.
My older brother, my younger brother, the 3 of us doctors, we were raised, the old-fashioned way. And
the top 3 are doctors.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
And then the rest of the 5, my parents decided they needed a different approach. So actually what I benefited from is watching them raise the new babies that would come into the family.
Wow.
And I think I benefited greatly from learning how to raise and be a very involved parent with all my younger siblings.
It might be a stretch, but I do think what you're describing, and it kind of makes sense based on your work with the book and your professional work. It sounds like he was an active learner. Your parents were both active learners. They were willing to change even how they parented mid childhood with the new set of kids, and I'm sure with you as you were getting older, as they got more information.
Yes,
and even if it went against maybe current cultural norms.
Yeah, and is very much built around the idea that each child is an individual. So each child might need their own tailored approach to being raised. You can't just do the same thing with every child. You have to adopt their temperament, their personality, who they are, and adjust your parenting style to fit. And that's what their 4th child demanded of them.
So making a segue now to your work, because it takes, I think, a lot, you used the word courage earlier, it takes a lot of courage, but it also takes a lot of, I would just say, intellectual openness, honesty, curiosity to, question sort of things that may seem unquestionable. And I think that's certainly in the medical world today, it is intensely controversial to have questions about vaccines. And, we're doing that on this show. We're not doing this to just say everything is bad and they're useless and don't ever get it. We're doing this to actually explore the research that you've compiled in a really fantastic way in your book, and really understand what are the concerns that are out there, weigh them, and explore the information that exists so that parents can make the decision that's best for their child, as you say in your subtitle, making the right decision for your child. When you were getting into writing this book, or before you wrote this book, what process did you go through that got you to the point where you would write a book on something so controversial that could potentially even endanger your career, when before this was not something that, it's not like you were raised with a dad who this was his campaign. He was not, this was not what your father was focused on as a pediatrician, but this became, would become one of your focuses.
Yeah, during medical school at Georgetown, my wife and we had our first child, and we needed a place to live for a few months. And some friends of ours who lived in the DC area offered us their basement apartment, but on one condition. I had to read a book that he was going to give me. And he said it was a medical book. And I kind of was a little grumpy about it because I guess as a 4th-year medical student, I felt like I already knew everything. So why would I need to read something else? And especially when I found out it was a book about vaccines. I objected, but my better half, encouraged me to read it, and so I did.
Did you know that every year 200,000 families go bankrupt from medical bills, even with health insurance. For many people, insurance is simply not working for them. That's why I'm excited to share with you about Crowd Health, which is an alternative model for paying for your healthcare. Crowd Health takes your bills, personally negotiates them on your behalf, and then sends out a request to the community to help cover your bills. The Crowd Health community has fully funded more than 5,000 medical bills over the last 2 years. This includes accidents like a young woman in Tennessee who lost her fingers in a boating accident, to NICU babies and cancer cases. Keep in mind, Crowd Health is not the same thing as insurance, but it is an alternative model to help pay medical bills and keep your monthly costs low. So go to Join Crowd Health today. Use the code Lila at checkout to get your first 3 months for only $99. That's joincrowdhealth.com and use the code Lila at checkout to get your first 3 months for only $99. Joincrowdhealth.com.
The book was really interesting. It was a book about a vaccine that was just about to be taken off the market because it was causing a high rate of severe brain injury. It's the old DTP, and it did get taken off the market.
How many kids, by the way, roughly received that before it was taken off the market?
Oh, well, everybody.
So millions of
all the kids
shots
born
given.
in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s all got the DTP. And so, a whole generation of kids. And but most of the kids handled it okay, but some didn't, and some were severely brain injured. And so when I read this book, I thought, well, that can't be true. Why would the FDA and the CDC keep it around if it was causing brain injury? And so I read this book, and it was full of scientific citations, research articles. And so my friend and I, we actually spent weeks down in the basement of the Georgetown Library pulling all these articles off the shelves. I wasn't going to take that book's word for it. It was a book written by a layperson, and so I wanted to do the research for myself. And I pulled out hundreds of scientific articles that did show this was causing severe brain injury, and the government wasn't doing anything about it, and they weren't taking it off the market. And so that kind of pissed me off a little bit.
This was pre it being taken off the market.
Yes. This was before it was taken off the market. And as a medical student, I kind of felt like my world was shattered. How can the ivory tower of the CDC and the FDA and all these institutions that were generating all the medical policy that I was learning at Georgetown, how could they kind of let this slip through the cracks? And that basically opened my eyes just to that possibility. Not that everything was bad, but this one was. And so I thought I should learn the truth about each individual. And so I basically did that same research with every and developed a more thorough knowledge of each level of safety versus risk, and each infection's risk, and how important each might be based on those criteria. And it basically shaped the way I started my pediatric practice several years later by prioritizing the I felt that were more important and not doing or delaying some of the I felt were less important. That was kind of like the initial way I was practicing with. And essentially, so many patients came to me who wanted answers, and I was spending like a half hour, 45 minutes, an hour with each patient individually, walking them through all these things. I thought, oh, I can't do this with every patient. No doctor has the time to spend an hour with each individual. So I decided I would put it to paper, put it in book form, and that's what I did.
So the book, you have every that's on the schedule, and this is the recommended schedule, right?
Yes.
And it's the CDC's recommended schedule.
Yes.
So you have you literally have the schedule, and then you have everything on that schedule, and then you go chapter by chapter to talk about the potential adverse effects that could have short-term, long-term, the advantages of, and you have a little bit of the history of the vaccine, what it's made out of, the actual ingredients of the vaccine, Have you received any criticism for the basic information that you share in this book?
Yes.
So,
yes.
But meaning, what I mean to say is, have people said, oh, he's sharing, the information is false? Or is it more they object to you having a book that says you should decide as a parent?
Right. Well, that's the primary objection. You're right. If you really get down to it, the mainstream medical community feels there is no discussion, there is no debate. Everyone has to fully. And so why even waste time talking about it? I feel a little differently, and I think today's parents feel differently. And the criticism I got right away was this very famous article written by another pediatrician called "The Problem with Dr. Bob's Alternative Schedule." And it was published as an op-ed in a very popular medical journal. And he put out maybe 20 points that he was highlighting that he was supposedly saying were wrong with my book. And I published a rebuttal, saying why he was wrong about his impression about my book. And so that was some criticism. And I think I got a lot of criticism in the media as well.
Was he quibbling with your data, though? Because data at the end of the day is data, and you can use the data to draw different conclusions, and you kind of leave the conclusions open to parents. Like, this is the information, you largely decide, right? So it sounds like he wasn't so much quibbling with the data you presented. It's more that you were saying you can decide, and he didn't like the different approaches you shared. You could do this, maybe don't do this. You could do this one. Was that what his biggest criticism was?
You are right. There wasn't a single fact or data point or piece of medical information that he objected to, or that anyone has ever objected to. It was basically, one example of what he objected to is there is a teenage meningitis that we give teenagers. And he objected to the fact that I didn't outright recommend or advocate for that vaccine, that I was neutral. I basically gave the pros and cons about meningitis as a disease for teenagers and meningitis as a vaccine, and what are the risks versus benefits. And then I stay neutral. I don't come out and say, oh yeah, and you should get your child this vaccine. He objected to that. And he said, how can a pediatrician not advocate for a teenage meningitis vaccine?
Yeah. So I think at the core, it's neutrality on vaccines, or the sense that parents should be able to choose. It's like the freedom to choose, medical choice. That is controversial.
Yes.
At its core.
Yes.
Why is that? How do you see that?
If you find out, you should let me know. There's a lot of conspiracy theories, of course, that I think would lend themselves to that very question. And I have a big problem with that, the fact that this is a question, because vaccines are by far the single most complicated and invasive medical treatment every child's ever going to get. You raise your child, you might give them 2 or 3 prescription medications throughout their childhood, maybe an antibiotic once. You're going to feed them, you're going to educate them, you're going to parent them. And you're at the doctor's office and the doctor's going to examine them. And during all those checkups, if you got every on the CDC schedule, including COVID every year, and
that's on the schedule now, COVID.
It is. You would get about 90 to 100 doses.
Wow.
If you got every single one of them. 90
to 100 doses of if you follow the CDC schedules for kids.
How can that not be a topic of conversation? That's you can't say that's going to be 100% harmless or no side effects for every child. This is a very invasive, complicated procedure. So I feel like it does deserve a very long conversation. It deserves informed consent. And so that's why I don't understand why doctors are so opposed to giving that to parents and providing that to parents and giving parents the time to think about it and talk about it. And I feel like that does a real disservice.
I want to start with some of these basics, which again, seem like they should be common knowledge when this is what most parents are told they absolutely should do, without even a conversation with every kid. But what is a vaccine? Let's start with that. What is a vaccine? And then I'd love to hear your take on the history of, I know this is a lot there, but the last several decades of how they have changed and how the schedule has changed. Every once in a while, I find a small business that I fall absolutely in love with. And that's why I'm so excited to share We Heart Nutrition with you guys. WeHeartNutrition.com is a vitamin and supplement company that provides the highest quality, research-backed ingredients, customized and optimized to help you be healthy. What I also love about We Heart Nutrition is that this is a family-owned company. And they're not just any family-owned company. This is a company that shares your values. And they donate a full 10% back of all of their revenue to pregnancy resource centers to help moms and babies in need. We Heart Nutrition customizes their vitamin packages specifically for your state in life. So whether you are premenopausal or postmenopausal, whether you're looking to conceive, help improve your fertility, whether you're pregnant, and this is a great prenatal vitamin, or you're postnatal. Plus, I'm very excited to share this with my husband. Now We Heart Nutrition has come out with their first line of men's vitamins. And if you order today at WeHeartNutrition.com, get your vitamins, you can get 20% off using the code Lila. And if you spend at least $50, you will get a free signature bamboo capsule vitamin box, which is very cute. I have one myself. So go to WeHeartNutrition.com today, use the code Lila at checkout to get 20% off your purchase. And when you spend $50, get that adorable free bamboo capsule box to store your vitamins in. That's WeHeartNutrition.com.
Okay. Right. I might forget some of those questions, so we can circle back.
Just pile it all on.
Yeah.
I'll remind you if you're so.
A vaccine is a germ component, either genetically modified from natural germs or genetically engineered in a laboratory from scratch, or crossbred and hybridized and altered forms of germs. So they basically take a changed or unnatural form of the germ, and they add a few chemicals to it to help your immune system react to it. And there's preservatives, and sometimes it's a whole germ, sometimes it's a small component of a germ. So when this product is injected, your immune system sees it and reacts to it with antibodies. So then you will have immunity floating around in your bloodstream, and your white blood cells will remember that infection and be ready to launch an immune response if you're ever exposed to the natural infection. That's what a vaccine is.
And so let's go back when were first introduced, as far as mass immunizations. Polio is what a lot of people go to here, and I think the defenders, those that are very concerned that anyone being skeptical of any risks are problematic, because they say you don't understand how devastating some of these epidemics were, and polio was basically eradicated because of we have all these immunities today because of past decades of immunizations, and if you just undo that work with skepticism, we're going to see horrible outbreaks. So anyways, I'm kind of presenting why you're getting, you got any flack at all, right? This is largely the position of people that don't like wasting time in their view on even questioning. They see them as this gift to humanity that have done incredible good over the last century. What is your take on that?
Right. Well, polio is a great example to illustrate that idea. We had polio outbreaks, and of course they were devastating, and kids were getting paralyzed, and adults were getting paralyzed. Interestingly, historically, about 99% of people who caught polio never even knew they had it. It was totally harmless. And maybe 5% of people would feel achy like the flu. It was a very mild infection for almost everyone who caught it. 1% of people would suffer nerve damage. And so that's how we knew it was going around our society, as we could see people suffer paralytic polio. And we knew a whole bunch of people around them were having harmless cases. And that's how we identified the infection. And so they came up with a vaccine. And I don't really argue with that. I mean, there was a need for that. And the that we developed that eventually helped us eradicate polio was the oral polio. We gave it by mouth. It was a live, and it would make people immune to the infection. And that helped us eradicate the disease from almost every part of the world. We still see it a little bit here and there. I believe Pakistan is, I think, maybe the only country that still has a little bit of polio. So that's kind of a success story, you could say.
There was one note that you made in the book, and I've seen it made before, that yes, the polio orally given at the time was very helpful, but that the timeline of when polio deaths dropped dramatically was not so much about the onset of the vaccine as it was about treatments of polio victims and identifying the disease earlier. Is that true?
Yes, that is probably true for every disease that we have a vaccine against. It's not so much that the vaccine, like polio, is why people stop dying from polio. It's you're right. It's medical care. It's advanced medical care is why people don't die from these infections anymore. But there's some argument that that helped us get rid of the infection. All right. It'd probably take a whole hour to go back and forth on every aspect of polio disease, polio. Some people think polio wasn't even a real disease. And some people think the polio didn't even do anything. I mean, there's all these criticisms of it. I don't know because I wasn't there.
Okay,
yeah,
sure.
I've looked at these old research articles, and it seems to me like polio was a real disease, and the did help. But there's some very smart people that question that.
But there is a timeline that is a fact for any, regardless of what narrative you would draw from the timeline. And correct me if I'm wrong, this is my understanding, I think I read here too in your book, is that there's a timeline that shows the spike of the deaths due to polio dropping dramatically even before wide usage of the because of medical care. Not to say that didn't help decrease infections and some deaths too, but that the amount of the kind of panic of all these children and the iron lungs and the whole thing of it, that was already declining dramatically before the onset of the delivery of the vaccine because of medical care. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. And to kind of highlight that idea and maybe to use it as one reason why you could say are less important today is that we are better at medical care. We're better at hygiene and sanitation and nutrition. The reason we've eliminated all these diseases from our society is probably 99% of those reasons. Better, healthier, cleaner living, better living standards. And it's poor countries where everyone lives huddled together, very dense populations of cities where things aren't clean. There's no sanitation. You think back to, the early 1900s and the 1800s. That's where these diseases could run rampant just because there was no sanitation, no hygiene. Now that we have all that, we wouldn't see these diseases come back. And even if people stopped, and that's primarily why these diseases were eliminated. Now, I feel like the vaccines helped some in certain cases. And I think with polio, that probably did help. But there's a huge but, to this success story of the polio vaccine. We eradicated polio. The last case in the United States was 1979, I believe, if I'm remembering the fact correctly. We kept using the oral polio vaccine through the 80s and most of the way through the 90s. And the polio vaccine was paralyzing 8 children every year in the United States. It would give 8 kids every year paralytic polio where they were permanently harmed.
They would get polio from
8 kids a year out of the 4 million we were dosing every year. 8 kids would suffer paralytic polio.
So 2 in a million, 1 in every 500,000, 500,000.
Yet we kept using the vaccine even though the disease had been eradicated.
Except for the disease caused by the
Correct.
was introduced. Yeah, it's
Correct.
tough.
So then the medical community got a little wise, and they changed to the injected polio. And that's what we've been using since the mid 90s to the late 90s. So everyone now gets an injected polio. That doesn't make you immune to the disease. If we had used that originally, it wouldn't eradicate polio from the world.
So what does it do?
It gives you internal immunity so you don't become paralyzed if you ever expose to the disease. So the current gives you that benefit. So if we ever have a polio outbreak, you won't suffer nerve damage. But it doesn't stop the transmission. It doesn't stop the spread of the disease. So the polio is no longer a public health benefit as far as keeping us safe from the infection. And so people would argue, well, why do I need a polio now? We don't have the disease, and it's not going to, me getting the isn't going to help you. It's not going to stop polio from coming back into our country. So why should I get the vaccine? And I feel like that's a particular question that each parent should be able to ask for themselves and their child.
What are the risks of the polio?
Well, there's not a lot of risk in that. It's actually one of the milder vaccines. And I say that now, but decades ago, in the 70s and 80s, they were using was contaminated with a monkey virus that was causing cancer in humans. And this was a long time ago, but they used monkey kidneys from Africa to help grow the and help make the
injected one.
The injected one.
Once they did away with the oral one.
Right, right.
Hey guys, Happy New Year, and make sure you have downloaded Hallow app. Hallow app is the #1 prayer app in the world, and it's a great way to jumpstart or deepen your relationship of prayer with God. Hallow app has over 10,000 prayers on it. It has amazing scriptural studies and deep dives into scripture. You've got Bible in a Year. You've got amazing prayers and meditations led by people like Jonathan Rumi of The Chosen. And you have sleep stories, kids content, and so much more. If you're wondering on a daily basis, how do I remind myself to carve out time for God and maybe have the guided prayer sessions or the scriptural readings or the spiritual readings that are going to strengthen your relationship with God, Hallow app is a great place to start. And if you use the link in the description today, you can get 3 months free at hallow.com/Lila. Get 3 months free of the Hallow app at hallow.com/Lila.
And so, and they started using this, and they didn't know that cancer-causing monkey virus was in the because they didn't have the technology to screen for it. It was later, decades later, that they realized, oh no, this simian virus number 40 is in the vaccine. We've injected entire populations with this virus, and it's caused cancer in many, many, many people. So now we know not to use those monkey kidneys, and we know how to screen for that virus. So there's always going to be like a downside that we don't know about. So even though the polio injected seems pretty safe, occasionally someone will have a really bad reaction. Like I was talking to one patient, one day in the office, and I was saying, yeah, the polio vaccine is pretty safe. And she said, oh, well, that's the vaccine that totally damaged me. I had severe autoimmune and neurological damage from a polio vaccine. I was like, wow, I've never heard of that happening from that vaccine. And so I feel like, this was one example of one. You could spend hours talking about each individual. And that's what the book does. It basically tells you, what is the history, what bad things happened years ago, maybe from that, how did the disease, how is the disease eradicated? How is the disease behaving today? What is your risk today of that disease? How do we treat the disease? And I walk you through both the history and the current status of each disease pair, so you can make that kind of educated decision.
So you said today the CDC schedule is up to 100 vaccinations for a kid by the time they're leaving childhood. What was it, say, 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't know if you've seen this meme online. It's a photo, and this kind of, illustrates that. A photo of a little girl, her mom, and their grandma. And they're all holding signs saying, I'm fully And the grandma's sign is like 10, and the mom's sign is probably like 30. And the kid's sign, back when this was made, it was 70.
Why? Why is that the case?
Vaccination used to be where we have a really terrible disease that's causing all kinds of harm. We need to get rid of it. Polio was a good example. You might say tetanus is worthy of vaccine because that's a terrible disease. Smallpox, if you go back, 120 years, smallpox was a terrible infection. Maybe diphtheria. We don't have diphtheria anymore either. All of these infections are mostly eradicated. We still have a little bit of tetanus, but barely. So the original idea of vaccination wasn't a bad one. We have these terrible diseases. People are dying. Let's see if we can give them immunity. But that has morphed into, instead of asking what diseases should we vaccinate against, it's changed into what diseases can we vaccinate against? What infections can we use our technology to produce a vaccine that creates immunity in people, gives them antibodies, get it passed by the FDA and get it supported by the CDC? What can we, introduce to the medical community? And if we can, then let's do it. And an example of that, it would be, say, the chickenpox. Chickenpox used to be a mild infection that everyone caught. Everyone got lifetime immunity. And it's kind of like a rite of passage. And
is that the varicella?
Varicella. And when we came out with that in the 90s, it wasn't because everyone said, oh no, everyone's dying from chickenpox, we need a vaccine. It was, and they actually discussed this in the medical community. It says, it's not that we need to save lives, but parents have to miss work if their kids catch chickenpox. Kids have to stay home from school. So school loses some of their attendance from kids. And it's not that fun to spend a week going through chickenpox. So can we develop a, let's try. They tried, they did, they got it approved. And now it's on the schedule and it's mandated to attend school in California. That's kind of an example of not just that, but other vaccines for diseases that are mild for almost everyone who catches it, but they can make it that generates immunity. So let's do it. Let's give it to everybody. And that's what vaccination has become.
What are the financial incentives to get a vaccine on the schedule?
The financial incentives, well, as a pediatrician, let's take me, for example. I give in my office at least one dose every day to someone who's getting vaccines for school because they're mandated here. And so my financial incentive could be I make a few dollars on giving that. We don't mark up our vaccines because I don't want to profit from giving a vaccine. But your typical pediatrician, say they buy that for $100 from the company that makes it, they might get $200 for the. So they make a little money, all right? And you often will get 4, 5, 6 in one visit with a patient. So you're getting, multiple hundreds of dollars from that patient visit for getting a vaccine. But that's not a bad thing. I mean, that's just how medicine works. But some of the behind the scenes incentives that I don't like, that I think make doctors angry towards patients who don't, or these policies make doctors mandate in their practice, is doctors get end of the year incentives and bonuses from the insurance companies for every fully vaccinated patient they have. Every patient that comes through their office, if that patient has gotten every vaccine, that doctor will get a bonus. Sometimes I've seen different levels of bonuses. I've seen bonuses on the level of $250 per patient. I've seen $400 per patient.
How many average patients, just so we can put it in perspective, would your average pediatrician have?
I would say
200, 300?
I have about 14,000 patients myself, But you're talking, say 1,000 kids come through your office.
That's $250,000
that year.
or $500,000.
Yeah, getting like checkups. Yeah. Oh, the bonuses are huge. And if you're an office that has 10 pediatricians,
wow.
Say you have 3 offices, like here in Orange County where we live. There's pediatric groups. They have 3-4 offices. They have 15, 20 pediatricians. That's multi-million-dollar bonuses you get for having fully patients in your office.
Why do the insurance companies want to incentivize doctors, pediatricians to fully?
Well, they kind of make it look like complete vaccination is a good thing. Mm-hmm. It's like a health marker for good outcomes. If you're a good pediatrician, you're going to have the healthiest patients possible. They're all going to be fully vaccinated. That's kind of the mindset.
But does that bear out in reality?
It doesn't, because no one's researched it.
Well, this is my next question, and I am very interested on the insurance company front, because they're money making machines. Insurance companies want to make money.
So why would they give out more money to their doctors if they didn't have to?
Yes.
If that's where you're going with this, and that's a great question, and I kind of wonder, where do the insurance companies get the money? I almost feel like they're incentivized by the pharmaceutical industry who makes the vaccines. Do they somehow incentivize insurance companies to promote their products and bonus doctors for giving their products? I don't know. I don't know if it's, say Blue Cross, say they're going to dish out $10 million to all their pediatricians this year for bonuses. Where does that money come from? I don't know.
We'll have to explore that on another episode. So there's a lot of different directions to go here, so much to explore.
I know,
which
right?
to go to first.
Right.
I mean, there's obviously the practice of going through each vaccine. And then I want to talk about the liability / the accountability. Maybe we'll go there next, as you mentioned that just a moment ago, of companies, because there is not, if there are risks or harm that the provides to a kid, right, who takes what's the current system for reporting whether or not there is even harm done to a child, and knowing whether that was from something else? And then I think you just mentioned too, what is the current, best practice for researching the safety of that?
The current reporting is called the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, or VAERS is what we call it. And if you have a bad reaction, you yourself as a parent can report it, or your doctor can report it. In fact, there's a federal law that says your doctor is supposed to report, is mandated to report any bad reactions that they are notified about. And that goes into a database, and people can access that database and read about side effects. And the downside of that database is that a lot of reactions will go unreported. Like the parent will tell the doctor and then think the doctor is going to report it, but the doctor doesn't have time to report it, or the doctor forgets. It takes a good probably half hour to fill out a VAERS report, if you know what you're doing. And so people have to take the time to do it. Some researchers looked at this dilemma and tried to calculate how many reactions are going unreported. And they estimated only about between 1 and 10% of severe reactions are even being reported.
Wow.
Between 1 and 10%.
So if there are, how many reports of adverse effects are made a year? Reports of effect.
That is a fantastic question. I used to know that number.
That's okay.
I mean, it's tens of thousands.
Okay.
Of severe reactions, if not more, annually.
So if it's tens of thousands, potentially it should be in the millions.
Possibly.
If that research is correct about,
right.
Or it would be in the hundreds of thousands at minimum, if that research is correct. So, and you're talking, how many children are in the United States? I know I'm putting you on the spot with these hairs.
No, I can do the math. We have about almost 4 million born every year.
Okay.
So kids through 18, that's 4 times 18,
so
4 times 20, 80 million, 70 million.
So school age children, we've got, Yeah, I think that sounds about right, because I was looking at how many kids are in private, public, or homeschool, and it's like around 70 or 80 million.
Yeah, total kids.
Check our number, total kids. So in any given year, there's going to be then, tens of millions of vaccines given out. I'm going to guess roughly.
Yeah.
But according to the research you just stated, we're talking hundreds of thousands of adverse effects potentially that we don't even know, though. That's the part of the problem. There's not like a required tracking system. It's voluntary.
Right. So
do you think that, and then one other aspect of this too is the companies in creating the vaccines, getting them to market, getting the CDC to put them on a schedule. What is the legal, what is the legal risks for companies if their product hurts somebody, hurts a kid?
Right. Right now, there is no liability for manufacturers. Back when that old DTP vaccine was around that I was talking about, that was causing brain injury, vaccine manufacturers were liable, and they were getting sued left and right over that. And the manufacturers threatened to stop making that vaccine unless the government would give them immunity. And for reasons I don't know, back then the government decided, well, yeah, we don't want anyone to stop making vaccines, so we're going to give pharmaceutical companies blanket immunity, not just from that, but from all vaccines that they make from that time on forward. I think it was in 1986 that they gave the pharma companies freedom from liability.
So right now, if your Fisher-Price rocker kills your child because it's made poorly, or the design is poorly made, or you eat some Taco Bell and it's poisonous because they don't have good, not to hate on Taco Bell, but you know where I'm getting. Like you can, there's a lot of like American society. You can be litigious. You don't even have to be litigious. This could be a just lawsuit. You can sue. Most anybody can be sued. But what you're saying is companies cannot be sued.
Right. And what drives safety in an industry? Liability is what drives safety. As a company, if you are liable, if someone's injured by your product, you're going to make darn sure you're going to make a safe product. And when you start hearing reports of a serious reaction, you're going to take steps to correct that. I don't know of a single case of a company ever changing their product in response to any of these severe side effects.
You mean to VAERS? Or meaning that those that are being reported, like the side effects that are being reported, the harm that is reported, the companies are not doing anything about it, is what you're saying. Right,
they're not, because they don't have to. If they were liable financially, you better bet they would. They would start making safer products. They would, like for example, let me just use an example of MMR, Measles, Mumps, Rubella. That causes a very severe arthritis reaction in probably about 25% of women who get that.
Wow.
Now, when you look at kids, it's much lower. It's much, much lower in kids. But when you look at adult women getting MMR, 25% suffer a terrible arthritis reaction.
Wow.
And then a small percentage of those will go on to have lifelong rheumatoid arthritis. All right. So the company that makes MMR, they know this, and they know the component of the we suspect is probably the Rubella virus components in that. So they could change the vaccine. They could take that component out. They could make it safer for all those women, but they don't have to. If they've had to dish out, $20 billion in damages over the years, then yes, you better bet they would change the vaccine so it doesn't cause that harm. But they don't have to. All of those damages are paid by a tax on vaccines. Every vaccine that a doctor buys and gives in their office, part of that money goes to a fund to give to people who are injured. So no one loses, I guess, except the patient. But no one suffers or no one pays for that liability. So no one's incentivized to take a look at each and try to make it safer. And if we did make them liable, if we made pharmaceutical companies liable, I feel like the industry would become a lot safer and people would be able to start to trust them again.
I think the argument for blanket immunity, as I understand it, and you can correct me if I do a poor job of representing it here, is that because vaccines are for the common good and they're not always about protecting oneself, there might be about protecting, your immunocompromised neighbor or this other younger person or older person for that matter. And therefore, we should be doing it together for the sake of the common good. Even if there's some very, very, very tiny risk, potentially, it's still worth doing it for the common good. And a company like that isn't really a viable company because it's sort of almost like a nonprofit mission. Pharmaceutical companies who produce are making a boatload of money. So let's not pretend they're nonprofits, but let's just go with the argument. And so anyways, all that to say, they need blanket immunity because otherwise they would get sued out of existence by the one person out of a million who has the adverse effect and just destroys, burns the whole house down. I think that's the general sense of reason why there is general immunity. What do you think about that?
Right. Well, what's interesting, if a product is so risky that companies need blanket immunity, and let's also argue, for the sake of argument, that say people are routinely being injured, like every year, a number of people are injured by vaccines, and we're not going to make them any safer. I feel like that creates a question as to, should we continue with this process of giving everybody every single vaccine and just keep going as we are? Or is there a better way to do this? I almost feel like the government and the medical community feel like we absolutely 100% have to keep vaccinating everybody no matter what the risk. And if we don't, we're all going to go back to the dark ages. I would argue that we've done a good job of ridding this world of almost all of these infections. The infections that are still around are manageable, treatable. We get through them. We have healthy societies that can handle some level of disease. So, could we do without at least some of these vaccines? Could we whittle the schedule down, maybe identify the ones that are the riskiest and no longer subject everybody to that risk and cut down on the number of severe reactions? Would be better off as a society? Would everyone actually be healthier? And we'd have a little bit of disease that we'd have to deal with, but would we be better off? I feel like it's a valid question. It's not a question that just should be easily dismissed. I think there's room for debate on that. And I think that's one of many questions that parents are asking today that they want the policymakers to think about.
I think a lot of people after the COVID pandemic became at least awakened to the fact that many of the institutions that they just would automatically trust might not be so trustworthy. And that's both on the government side and how things were handled politically, but then certainly on the medical side, people just were really disappointed with how the COVID vaccine, many people were disappointed with how the COVID vaccine was pushed on people as an absolute necessity when, especially for children, when children were not at risk and there were potential side effects that weren't even unknown because it was fast-tracked, the approval. And I think it awakened a lot of people to the fact that what we kind of grew up with as, oh yeah, of course, this is how it should be, this is how it's always been, might actually be a problem. And it takes a brave voice to say, hey, this actually, we've been doing this the last couple decades and this is how you were raised and it keeps adding to the schedule, but maybe there's a problem here.
Right. Yeah, everyone got a front row seat to watch how the COVID vaccines were fast-tracked and approved, how they were made, and how the government balanced the healthcare policies of our country regarding COVID and the policies they created during the lockdowns. And we all watched how that happened. And I think that's given rise to the most common new patient that I get in my office now. It's a patient with their third child. They fully They did their first two. They did everything, that their doctor told them. They watched us all go through COVID. And now they're saying, hold up. Now I know how the government does things. And now I know how the pharmaceutical industry does things. Now I have some questions. And I'm not just going to blindly trust it anymore. I'm going to ask you some questions and find out more about it before I let my third child start on the CDC schedule. So many new patients like that, and parents all over the country, all over the world, I think are no longer trusting the government pharmaceutical entities that make these policies because of what we saw happen with COVID. I mean, it kind of, you could talk forever about COVID, right? And what went right, what went wrong. But the bottom line, what we know now is the COVID, when it was produced and when it was mandated, there was no evidence it prevented transmission. There's no evidence that it reduced the spread of the virus from person to person. All they figured out it did is it might make your own individual case milder, but they had no evidence whatsoever that it would influence transmission or help end the pandemic in any way. Yet, what did the government do? They mandated it. What did employers do? They mandated it. It was mandated not for everybody everywhere, but it was mandated in a lot of places. And so parents watched our government doing that. And some people just said, okay, that sounds good to me. I always trust the government. But 51% of our country said, no, I don't like that the government is doing this without science to back it up. So government, I'm not going to 100% trust you anymore on this.
I think the biggest I've seen just in what I've observed happening online, in my community, personal life, friends and family, people far away, that the doubling down by medical professionals on you're not allowed to ask questions, you're stupid, and of course you should do this, actually increases skepticism.
Absolutely.
And it's kind of understandable because even when you do that with a 5-year-old, like once they hit the age of reason, when they're 2 or 3, it's like, no, mom said, just don't do it, right? You can only explain so much to a 3-year-old. Once they hit 5, 6, 7, and I know because my oldest is now 5, like he's ready for the explanation and you still want to assert your authority. But even the 5-year-old wants the explanation. Of course, the grown adult who has children of their own that they are passionate about protecting and they are entrusted with these children, they're going to need and damn well deserve an explanation. And so I think the refusal to give the explanation is driving the distrust. So for those that are, very pro, maybe the whole even schedule, I would say give the explanation, win the trust. That's going to be more effective for your cause in the end than anything else.
Right. But what's interesting is part of the reason why I think doctors in general have, how you put it, doubled down on this is research has shown that when parents investigate vaccines, they become less compliant. They're actually less likely to if they investigate.
I wonder why. Why do you think that is?
I know, right? Right. I can kind of go back to sitting in the doctor's office with our first child, my wife and I. And back then in the state we lived in, you were mandated to read all the side effects and sign that you had read all the possible side effects before you got the vaccine. And we read through the side effects and they're horrible. And my wife was crying and she's like, I don't want to do this. Why would we give our baby a vaccine that, could create all these horrible side effects? And, being the doctor, I was like, well, we have to do it. It's going to be good for him. And she tells me, I even use the words, it's for the good of society. And that's just one small example. If you read the list of side effects, and it's a little scary. And so back in the 90s, many states had mandated informed consent policies where patients had to read all the side effects. Doctors started complaining and saying, people aren't vaccinating now. So they took that mandate away. They no longer made it mandatory for states to give any informed consent.
When did vaccines first become mandatory for education?
In California,
Was it
it's
California?
a state law.
It's a state law.
Right. So
is California one of the only states that have mandated vaccinations for
one of the only
school?
states. Yeah. So for many, many years, Mississippi and West Virginia were the only two states that had mandates for many, many years. And then I believe, gosh, the time flies, but I believe it was 2015 where they mandated them in California, and they mandated them in New York, and maybe before that in New York.
Do you know what the circumstances were of the mandate?
Measles outbreaks. I think it was the measles outbreaks that that prompted schools to not just mandate a measles vaccine, which maybe that would have made sense. They mandated lots of vaccines. They mandated, like in California, they mandated chickenpox, even though we haven't had any bigger problems with chickenpox. They mandated hepatitis B vaccine for all babies in daycare, all preschoolers, and all children in school in California.
I want to talk about that one. And I promised our listeners I would get into the brass tacks with you of some of these. And I know this could take literally days and days and days, but we'll do a couple. And I do want to talk about Hep B because that is the first vaccine that is mandated in the state of California if you want your child to eventually go to a daycare or preschool or, go to school. And it's birth 1 month, and then they have to get it again, I think, at 6 months, according to the CDC recommended schedule. Now, I know there's some wiggle room with when and how they're given and still to meet California requirements. But generally speaking, you go to the pediatrician and they tell you this. And I'll just share a personal story with my first child going to a pediatrician. I think it was in Los Angeles. And she was saying, oh, it was in my newborn baby. You have to get, and it was hepatitis B. And I said, can you tell me more about that? Like, I'm not against or anything, but just in terms of the timeline and would like to learn more. Totally shut down. Not allowed to know more. Don't have time to talk to you about it. Of course, I'm the doctor. You're this patient. You're stupid, or your son's the patient in this situation. But then I said, well, what is hepatitis B? Isn't that like a sexually transmitted disease? And I don't have it. I didn't have it, obviously. And my son, I'm not planning to even send him anywhere that he would, be able to pick that up. He's a newborn. And she made some comment about he might step on a needle because we were living in downtown LA. And maybe this was fair, but there might be a drug addict's needle that has hepatitis B in it. And if my newborn baby steps on the needle, that sounds horrible, then he'd get hepatitis B. And so I'd love to hear your take on hepatitis B.
Yeah, one of the stories I've heard from a patient is a nurse in the hospital nearby here told them, well, what if one of the nurses here that works in the hospital who has hepatitis B accidentally bleeds on your baby?
Gosh.
You got to get this.
You're like, we're getting out of here.
Yeah. They couldn't get out of there fast enough. That's another that made me start to question things all the way back at Georgetown in the early 90s. When I saw our government put that on the schedule for every newborn baby, that didn't make any sense to me as a doctor. And it didn't actually make sense to many of my colleagues either. Why would babies need for a sexually transmitted infection? And the rate of babies and children catching Hep B through some
freak accident.
Yeah. Something that's, astronomically, low chance of happening. I mean, they didn't even know how many kids, but the best that I could research is that there might be something like 30 kids a year or 20 kids a year in the country somehow accidentally coming up with this virus.
Was that transmitted from their mother? Some of them?
Not including mother, not including transmission from mothers. So is it living
in a household?
Yeah, almost like an accident. Yeah.
So it's like living in the household with someone who has Hep B and they're literally bled on kind of thing. Like AIDS, almost like AIDS transmission. Right. That's not via birth. If you get in touch with their blood, then you might get AIDS.
Right. So it was super unlikely.
HIV. Yeah.
Yeah, super unlikely. So I did a little research way back then, and what I found was 2 doctors that helped develop the Hep B vaccine for 2 different pharmaceutical companies, because there were 2 products. They're the ones that published a whole bunch of research that actually put forth the hypothesis that as many as 30,000 kids were coming down with Hep B every year accidentally in our country. They made up these data. They totally made it up. And they published that, and everyone freaked out. The medical community said, oh no, that many kids are coming down with Hep B. We better do something about it.
No one questioned the data?
No one questioned it, except for me and a few other people. So
is that a common thing in medical journals that stuff gets published that...
Yes, especially when there's a financial reason for it.
Or maybe when it's red hot controversial and people don't want to question things. Is that part of it, or?
I don't even know. I'm not in the academic world. I mean, I kind of was a lot more academic back then because I was, in school, but that just made no sense to me. And so then when I saw that the two doctors that published that study worked for the two pharmaceutical companies that made Hep B vaccine, I was like, well, that's clear conflict of interest. Clearly, they're being paid to put forth this false data and get everyone to buy it. But that's kind of what the medical community does. If it's published in a medical journal that has a great reputation, everyone believes it. So everyone sat back and let our government put Hep B onto the schedule. And so when
how much money? Oh, so go ahead.
Well, when we see people make policies like that, that's again what makes parents question it.
How much money? I don't know if you know this, but how much money are these pharmaceutical companies making from the Hep B?
Well, if you want to do some quick math,
let's do it.
The 3 doses probably cost me about $200 total to buy 3 doses of Hep B.
And that's what the child is given ultimately.
Yeah, so times that by 4 million kids being born every year. 4 million times 200.
It's $800 million.
$800 million.
Yeah.
In a year.
Almost $1 billion.
Yeah.
From that's just extra cash.
Yeah. Yeah. So we kind of go back to what I said earlier. Let's make vaccines not that we need to make or that our society needs to save us from infection. Let's just figure out what can we make and get them on the schedule.
So what are the risks of the Hep B?
The main risk of Hep B is that it can cause fever. And
you're spiking a little one's first fever.
It's probably around 1% or might be a 0.5% of babies who get a Hep B will get a fever. And if you're a newborn in a hospital who just got the Hep B, if you spike a fever, they send you to the intensive care unit for antibiotics. And so that happens more now to babies than it used to because we give them something that can induce fever on day 1 when it's completely unnecessary. The other risk from Hep B used to be back when they first made it. Unfortunately, it was one of the vaccines that had mercury. And so everyone born in the 90s that got that got a nice little dose of mercury. They took it out, but it has aluminum in it. And aluminum, you know how our society is trying to be very careful with like aluminum in deodorants and aluminum in other cosmetics, and we're trying to limit our exposure to aluminum. Well, a lot of have aluminum, and Hep B is one of them. And so you give that to a baby day 1, and we know aluminum isn't good for brain tissue and developing nervous systems. And so that's something, if your baby doesn't need a vaccine for a disease they're never going to see, at least for 15, 20 years, why even take that risk? And to me, that's kind of like a no-brainer.
Because you can do the Hep B as a young teen or an older teen
Absolutely.
And get immunity that way. If you are concerned with sexual activity or you want to somehow deal with it, then you don't, what you're saying is you don't have to do it early in childhood. If you can still get the immunity later in life by taking it later in life.
Absolutely. But it scared people thinking that 30,000 kids are getting Hep B every year based on the published research. And we didn't want to, leave people unimmunized. So that's how it went down.
So you go through, and I do want to get to a couple more specifically in our time and then talk about the risks and ingredients more as well. But I do want to ask you, what do you currently recommend as the best schedule for a newborn in the first year of life?
Well, I like to answer that basically by saying what happens in my office with patients. My own recommendation is pretty neutral. Like I offer I offer the full CDC schedule. No one ever takes me up on it in my office. None of my patients ever want the full CDC schedule, but I kind of offer it just kind of as a default starting point. I don't tell any of my patients, yeah, you absolutely 100% have to get these 3 or these 5 or even this one. I'm not 100% an advocate for anyone. Now, I think some of them are more important than others, but none that I just sit down and say, okay, you got to get this one. You got to do these 5 doses of this one over the next few years so your kid is guaranteed immunity from this one thing. I wouldn't say there is one that kind of fits that criteria. Mm-hmm. What happens in my office, however, is most of my patients come to me not wanting any at all. Like they've already made their decision. Most of them honestly don't even ask my opinion. They've read many books. They've read many research articles. They've studied it. They come to my office with their new baby, confident in their decision to raise a baby totally free. And they say, thanks, but no thanks. And we're good. And I raise them in my office without giving them that's kind of the majority of what I'm seeing now in my office. When people ask my opinion, I make them go read the book. I make them go, watch the podcast, watch some videos. I make them kind of get educated. And then they come back and we have a half-hour discussion where I kind of like we're talking now. I basically go through the pros and cons. I don't advocate for or against anything. I just kind of lay out the risk versus benefits kind of in a summary. And I'd say 99% of my patients choose to not opt in for anything now.
Do you get any kind of discrimination from the state of California? Because you're a doctor who's daring to say what you're saying right now and writing your book, and B, you run a practice where you have so many patients who are opting not to.
Yes, I did. Yes. Yeah. The state of California, the medical board of California came after me for the advice that I give on vaccines. Ultimately, whenever I saw a patient who had a really bad reaction to, I would agree with that patient that their bad reaction warrants them choosing to not do any more vaccines. I basically sided with them. Yeah, sided with them. And then in some cases, I would actually then write them a medical exemption from needing to be vaccinated, right? The Medical Board of California took exception to that. And they said, and they're right about what they said, right? They said that the standard of care for deciding who should be exempt from vaccines is only limited to people who have been severely brain injured by a vaccine or suffered severe anaphylactic shock and almost died from an allergic reaction.
So the only way you're allowed to get a medical exemption in California is if you have severe brain injury or go into paralytic anaphylactic shock.
Yeah. Right.
But if you have, long-lasting immunocompromised issues or arthritis or something like this, it doesn't matter. You got to get the full schedule to go to public school or to go to school.
Exactly. And I disagreed. I said, no, if I have a patient who had a temporary nerve injury that I've seen, where someone's arm stops working or they lose all the sensation and the movement in their facial muscles after a vaccine. I've seen a few kids' eyes get paralyzed after, or their eyes stop working and they can't track anything. And I've seen the arthritis reactions. I've seen seizure reactions. I've seen a lot of moderate allergic reactions where they didn't go into anaphylactic shock. They didn't almost die. They just halfway went there. And the state of California says, no, those reactions are not bad enough to warrant a medical exemption. And so that's why they came after my medical license.
You still have your medical license.
I do. I survived that attack.
What do you think about the fact that they did that they came after you and that they have this policy in the state where they're forcing millions of kids ultimately over years to be vaccinated in order just to go to school?
I know, and well, I wrote a whole book on it. The right there in front of you, the
One Doctor versus the Medical Board, a novel, a true story novel, right?
Yeah,
But
inspired by true events, right? It's. I mean, it was a fascinating time in my life to watch the government of California, basically, where it used to be that people who had these bad reactions that didn't almost kill them, they just suffered some moderately severe reactions where they could opt out medically and not have to see the state of California take that away from parents and limit exemptions to only severe brain injury and anaphylactic shock. That almost put me into anaphylactic shock. I mean, I couldn't believe they were doing this. And we begged the legislators not to do this. Me and many of my colleagues and tens of thousands of parents went up to Sacramento and begged the legislature to allow parents to opt out of if they had moderately severe reactions. And they just said, sorry. The CDC, and they based their criteria on CDC criteria. They said the CDC made the rules that exemptions, should be limited to these two severe situations, and so we're just going to go based on the CDC. And so it was a big fight. Many people fought it.
But the CDC knows it doesn't have the power to. It's not forcibly all children in America.
The CDC
Most states
can,
have medical freedom and allow you. Yeah, you want to get go for it. If you don't, go for it.
Right. So the CDC makes medical policy that states don't have to follow. Doctors will listen to them. Doctors will follow the CDC advice, and some state governments will, but some state governments won't. So the state of California chose to follow the CDC guidelines on this. And so that's kind of why I say the medical board was kind of right, and that they're right. If you ask, 100 doctors nationwide, what are the criteria for getting a medical exemption from 99 of them will say brain injury and anaphylactic shock. And one of them will be like me and say, no, it has to be broader than that.
Do you think a lot of doctors might secretly agree with you if there wasn't such a tremendous blowback or professional risk?
Wow, interesting. I've always wondered that, actually. And
like it's a groupthink mentality.
No, I feel like post-COVID, more and more doctors are coming out of the woodwork and then coming out of kind of their hidden place where they have shared some of my concerns, but it just have been too afraid to talk about it. So actually, yes, more and more doctors are now coming out saying that maybe our vaccine policy overdoes it. Maybe we're giving too many vaccines, some unnecessary vaccines. And will we see a shift in actual policy? I hope so, especially with this new administration. We're not going to get rid of vaccines. No one's going to make a huge change in policy, but I think we're going to see more accountability and see better science, see better safety studies. And I think we'll see the financial influence of the pharmaceutical industry. Hopefully we'll see that be eliminated from policymakers. And when the government and the CDC are going to decide about that, they're not going to do it. They're not going to let a bunch of people who are being paid by the pharmaceutical companies make those decisions, because that's how it's been up to now. People on the CDC and the FDA boards that make policy, they receive money from manufacturers.
Really?
Yeah, and I think that's going to come to an end, hopefully.
How is that? They receive money as consultants?
Yes. A lot of these are doctors that have done research for the companies for many years.
So they're double dipping. They're basically serving in this government capacity, and then they get money on the side. I mean, my understanding is like if you work at NIH, you're not allowed to get money from independent research or businesses.
You're right. There are rules where, as you are working at NIH, you can't get pharmaceutical money, but you could have gotten it before then, and you can get it after. In fact, the doctor who ran the CDC's division for 8 years, from I think 2002 to 2009, she ran all policy of the CDC for 9 years. During that time, she owned I think $5 million worth of stock in a manufacturing company.
And that's allowed.
That is allowed
assets.
because that stock existed prior to her coming to the CDC. So she has this stock. She has a big financial incentive for this company to thrive. And then when she left the CDC in 2009, guess who hired her to lead their division? That company.
Yeah.
She went and worked for that company. So it's that kind of double dipping. It's not illegal. It's unethical, but people, for the most part, will follow the legal guidelines where you can't actually get, money put into your hand while you're at the CDC, but so much money goes in before and after. And I think that's what the policymakers now in Washington are going to try to eliminate that factor from this process so that people can hopefully start to better trust the policies that the CDC makes.
I want to get to a couple more.
Yes.
And I know there's, again, 100 different, according to the CDC schedule, 100 different doses, but we've got the schedule that you share in the book, and then you go again through each one. A couple of we talked about polio, we talked about Hep B, we talked a little bit about chickenpox, about varicella. You mentioned TDP before it was Tdap, right?
Right.
And then it was changed to be Tdap. Let's go to DTaP, excuse me, DTaP. Yes. And then I also want to ask about Hib and MMR. So you mentioned earlier DTP caused severe, was it paralysis?
A severe brain injury.
Severe
the old
brain
one
injury.
that they used to use.
The old one. They updated it. Tell us about DTaP today.
Well, DTaP today is a scaled down version of the old one that used to cause a lot of severe brain injury. The drawback is that it doesn't work very well. It certainly does not prevent transmission of whooping cough. And that's why we still have a lot of whooping cough today, is that doesn't stop person-to-person transmission.
And just for folks listening, DTaP, and again, a lot of people listening are already educated on this, but for folks who are maybe becoming educated, what does DTaP include
DTaP is
and stand
diphtheria, tetanus, and whooping cough. Or pertussis.
Pertussis.
Starts with a P. So DTP, DTaP. So it doesn't work as well. But it is milder. It doesn't cause as much brain injury as the old did.
Does it cause some?
It still can cause some, yes. In fact, this used to be on the informed consent paperwork that parents used to have to read. The new version of the caused brain inflammation in about 1 in 1,000 babies who got the.
And then what does that mean for them, brain inflammation?
It means their brain swells and they have nonstop inconsolable screaming for 3 hours, 4, 5, 6 hours. They might have a high fever. They just go through this intense, horrible screaming period that's completely inconsolable. It's because their brain is swelling from an immune reaction to the.
Do they heal from that completely? Are there any long-lasting effects?
They will calm down. They'll then sort of go through a period of extreme lethargy and be totally out of it and kind of sleep it off. And it's about 1 in 1,000 babies that happens to, according to the CDC.
Do you think it's more?
That is an excellent question.
Because how do we know? Is it reporting? I mean, is it reported?
How they came up with that 1 in 1,000 number, I don't know. They took that number off the consent forms. Now it just says your baby has a rare chance of having inconsolable screaming. They took off the 1 in 1,000 and any mention of possible brain injury. They took that off. But I don't know how common it is. I can say I've seen it. I've seen babies have that kind of temporary brain swelling, and most of them recover. The thing is, though, you're giving this vaccine 4 times during infancy. So if it happens once and happens again, but you don't know it, then your baby has, say, 3 or 4 episodes of brain swelling from the DTaP. Yeah, I mean, 999 babies might take that just fine, and then 1 baby doesn't. And then does that repeated brain swelling cause some problems with that baby down the road? The possibility is there that does. And so I think.
Has it been studied?
It has been studied. Mm-hmm. It hasn't been studied very thoroughly. What
does that mean? Because this is given again. This is on the schedule. This seems like one of the, if you're maybe don't do Hep B, okay. Maybe don't do a flu shot, okay. But DTaP, whooping cough is bad. Tetanus, lockjaw, you could die from tetanus. It seems pretty serious. Yeah. So I think.
Yeah. Well, this is where it's about informed consent. Yeah. So for example, in our country, about 10 babies die from whooping cough every year. Okay, about 10.
What are the circumstances typically?
Typically, a newborn in the first 1 or 2 months of life, maybe a 3-month-old. That's the age range where we see whooping cough can be fatal.
Are they dying because they're not getting medical care quickly enough to prevent them from dying?
That's part of it. So
it's not like they're getting good care and then they just die.
Well, sometimes it is.
Okay.
So it's a very small number of babies. About 10 babies a year die of whooping cough, and they're pretty much all newborns. And maybe some didn't go to the hospital soon enough, but some did. Sometimes that disease is just so bad for a newborn that you can't do anything. Now, when you look at kids older than that, say 6-month-old babies and 1-year-olds and 5-year-olds, they just go through whooping cough and they're fine. All right. It's only something that's terrible for newborns. So you don't want that to happen to your baby. But then you say, well, then I'm going to give my baby that vaccine. Then you have about a 1 in 1,000 risk of your baby suffering a brain swelling reaction. So you kind of, as a parent, you kind of look at those numbers. Do I want to take the risk that my baby's going to be one of those 10 that die this year of the disease, and accept that risk, or do I want to have my baby go through infancy without that risk and just live with that? 10 babies and 4 million babies. It's like 1 in 250,000, babies. It's like that. Thank God that
one in
the
every
fatality
500,000.
Is
right?
it? Yeah. I'm so bad at math.
400,000 something, but 1 in every 400,000.
Thank God that these diseases are so uncommon.
Right.
That when we see these terrible things, it's more of an anomaly.
So here's a question too, and it is part of it. Like if a child is getting whooping cough, obviously, technically, I guess anyone could get it, but are you more likely to get a disease like whooping cough if you are going to daycare every day at a young age?
Yeah, yes.
Like if you're just like a breast, because you mentioned in your book multiple times the protective elements of not just being breastfed exclusively in the first year of life, but also not being, schlepped off to daycare every day. Or multiple days a week. And the reason is you obviously dramatically increase your exposure when you're around a bunch of other kids. And then obviously breastfeeding can provide a lot of antibodies and nourishment that helps a baby ward off sicknesses.
Yes, you certainly could look at your own family's lifestyle and factor that into your risk assessment.
If the 10 whooping cough deaths were breastfed non-daycare babies.
Right. I don't have data on that. Right. Those data probably do exist, but I haven't, whittled it down that way. But part of the decision, you mentioned tetanus. Yeah, you don't want a baby to catch tetanus. But my answer to that is, thank God, we only have about 1 baby in our whole country every year that comes down with tetanus.
Do they die from it?
They can.
But actually, that 1 baby isn't dying from it. It's just getting it.
They're catching tetanus. And so when you get tetanus, you sort of become partially paralyzed. You have all these kinds of nerve problems, and you have to be in the intensive care unit. And it's a terrible disease. And it's about 1 baby or toddler age kid in our country every year comes down with that, usually probably from an accident. Maybe they're in a big car accident or something like that, and they get some terrible wounds. And so tetanus festers in there. But your basic, just everyday baby crawling around playing, they don't get tetanus. So that's in the DTP.
So you can't get, like if you're playing in the backyard and you get a scrape.
You're not going to get
tetanus.
There's
an old watering can. You get a scrape.
No, just doesn't happen.
So where do you get, you really do just get tetanus from someone hacks off your leg with an old axe, or you're in a car accident, gruesome here, but
that, or say you live on a farm,
okay,
and you're running around the farm in the dirt where all the farm animals are pooping,
okay,
right, and all that manure is there,
and you're barefoot,
and you're barefoot, and there's a rusty rake that's been sitting there for 10 years. You that goes through your foot.
I see.
That's a tetanus risk.
I see.
Right.
Now, even if that were to happen, is there a way you can mitigate the risk of deadly tetanus, even if you put the rake through your foot?
Yes, you can. So even if you're not, for tetanus, or even if you are, you can get a fast-acting injection that neutralizes tetanus right away.
Amazing.
So that if you are in that circumstance, you're not at the mercy of the infection. And so, the DTP, whooping cough, tetanus, diphtheria is in there. We don't have diphtheria in the United States. We haven't had it for many, many years.
Why is that in there?
Well, because that's how they've made it, and they just have never bothered to take it out. Again, because no one's rethinking this.
There's no liability or reason to take it out.
Yeah, they're just sticking with the old vaccine, saying we've always made them this way. There's no reason to change it. And so that's kind of what each parent has to decide. You look at disease risk, you look at vaccine risk, and you make these individual decisions based on each.
Okay, the other one that's very controversial among some is MMR.
Yes.
Tell us about MMR, its risks and advantages.
Yeah. How long do we have?
At least a few minutes.
I'll give you the 2-minute version. The disease risk. The good news is measles, mumps, and rubella pose almost no risk as far as the diseases go. Measles, no children have died from measles in the United States in over 20 years.
Wow.
We had one child die in 2002 during an outbreak. And then, going back into the 90s, we had, a few kids die. And in 1990, there was an outbreak. And I think there were maybe a dozen deaths or something. So
sorry to interrupt, but when there was that outbreak in California several years back, or a decade ago or so, then they mandated in the state of California just to go to school, and it was because you said of the measles outbreak, no children died?
Oh, no one died. No one in a modern country like the United States dies of measles anymore.
What happens? Were there lifelong complications?
No. You go through it and you're fine. Now, if you are in an impoverished country, like where kids are starving and they're malnourished, measles is terrible. Actually, measles ravages some countries in Africa where kids die left and right. If you are malnourished, measles is not a good infection to catch.
What would you give the starving child in Africa first? The measles or food?
I would give them food. I would give them food and vitamin A. Vitamin A specifically helps protect you from measles complications. And so when you look at MMR diseases, measles, when you look at mumps, no one dies of mumps. We've eradicated rubella from our country. We don't have rubella anymore. And so those infections pose very little danger to American kids today. Most people who get the vaccine, they handle it just fine, and then there's no problems. But this is one that has some potential for side effects, and probably has one of the longest lists of possible side effects out of all the. And the reason is it's a live virus. We're giving live measles, mumps, and rubella germs to you when we inject you with this. They are weakened and they've been modified in the laboratory to kind of change their characteristics a little bit, so they're less likely to actually give you a real infection. But some of the risks are, some of the side effects are that brain swelling, again, like with the DTaP that we talked about, brain inflammation.
So theoretically, by the way, the child that's getting fully could have multiple brain swelling episodes from multiple different, especially if they're prone to it or they're sensitive to it. Yeah. But
the MMR in particular, very rarely, maybe like 1 in a million, can cause a very severe brain injury, kind of like the kind that would get you medically exempt from the, again, severe brain injury. But that's super rare. But you can have all kinds of allergic reactions from MMR.
Super, but it's more common than children dying from measles.
Oh, absolutely. 100%. Yeah. I would say if you actually looked at data from severe lifelong reactions to MMR vaccine and compared it to severe or fatal, cases of measles, you'd see way more from the vaccine. Now, because we've eliminated, for the most part, measles and
we've eliminated, and this is again the argument for we've eliminated it largely because of the vaccine.
I would say yes. Measles is a vaccine where you can argue pretty strongly that is why we don't have measles anymore.
So if, let's just say theoretically, people just stopped getting the MMR vaccine, how long would it take, would you say, until measles started making a comeback?
Well, let me briefly say the reason we still have it today is the reason why we have these outbreaks is largely because adults have no immunity.
Even if you get the as a child?
Right. If you get the as a child, it wears off. So you become an adult completely open to measles. You don't have immunity. Everyone who catches measles as an infection when they're a child, they have lifelong immunity.
Wow.
So that's kind of how it went down. Like, 50, 60, 100 years ago, you catch measles when you're a child, you're fine, you grow up and you're immune. Now that we've eliminated that disease from our country, kids don't catch measles anymore. They get the vaccine and they grow up to become adults and it wears off. So when an outbreak happens, say the outbreak is even started by an unvaccinated child, which happens. Certainly an unvaccinated family goes to Europe, their kids catch measles, they bring it back, and then it spreads to people around them, largely adults, because adults don't have immunity. And then all the kids around them who are likely immune. So I mean, it's an interesting dilemma because this vaccine has some potential side effects for kids, and we don't really have the disease around, but we don't have the disease around because of the vaccine. So you can just go in circles, over and over again. And so where do you fall as a parent? That's kind of where you have to make that decision as a parent.
I've got to ask you about, you mentioned aluminum earlier, and the other thing that a lot of parents, especially pro-life parents, object to is the fact that, remind me which vaccine it is that was created out of the cell line of an aborted babies.
Yes, it's the MMR. It's several. It's MMR, the Rubella component. It's the chickenpox vaccine. It's hepatitis A, which we haven't even talked about. And then it's one brand. Oh gosh, I don't want to say the wrong thing. It's either it's one more, but I can't remember what that fourth one is.
I'm bringing this up because first of all, my understanding is it's not actually the cells of that aborted baby. Of course, it's cell
not
lines.
The whole cell.
It's cell lines from the aborted baby from decades ago. Right. But you're still getting the DNA of that baby. You're injecting part of the DNA of that baby into your baby's body.
Correct. If you get any of those three.
And you talk about this in the book, and the research is not conclusive on this, is my understanding, but share more about the potential risks of injecting someone else's DNA into your child. And by someone else, we're talking about a child who is aborted. So
the theory is that it might increase autoimmune reactions. Like when another human's DNA goes into your body and your immune system sees it and your immune system reacts, it might make your own immune system turn around and react against you and attack your own DNA and attack your own body because it's reacting to this other human component in a very inflammatory way, in a very artificial way. So then it's going to find other human components to attack. That's kind of the theory. I got to say, we don't know exactly what's going on there and for sure what these DNA fragments are doing in our bodies. People have done research on it and found that it's possible there's this autoimmune problem going on. For me personally, it's like it just creeps me out thinking I'm injecting a product with that kind of background in it that was made that way with those components and injecting that into me. I don't know, it's in a very unscientific way. It just gives me the creeps, and I just don't feel good about it. And and a lot of parents also don't feel good about it, and they also don't like it when the medical community denies that it's there. You ask any doctor if there's fetal components, they'll say no. If you ask a researcher who knows, they'll usually admit that it's there, but most doctors won't admit that it's there, and because maybe they just don't want that to be part of the discussion.
There's so much more here, and I'm incredibly grateful for your courage in writing this book and your books and speaking on this. What would you say is a message you may have to someone who's listening who is, concerned? Like they see the research, they're concerned, but they still feel like everyone else is telling me I should do this. I mean, in the state of California, they're telling me I have to do this to send my child to school. What would you say to that parent?
I like to tell parents that honestly and sadly, because your doctor won't talk to you about this, as everyone knows, you go to a doctor who has a mandate in their office, they'll kick you out if you ask questions, if you don't comply. So unfortunately, you can't expect to have a nice long hour-long friendly discussion with your doctor. You have to do your own research. And, I would read several books. Read books written by doctors. Do your own research. But you can't wait until your 2-month appointment where your baby's supposed to get 8 vaccines. You can't wait till that appointment to start asking questions. You got to start researching it sooner. I think that it does everyone a disservice if parents have a new baby and they're not sure about vaccines, but they don't even really do any research and they expect to go into their doctor's office and have an hour-long discussion. The doctor has 3 other patients they're supposed to see that hour, first of all. And then if they have a mandate in their practice, they're not going to answer your questions. Then you're left frustrated. This is almost something where it's almost the consumer's responsibility to take it upon themselves to do their own research. You just have to. Either that or find a doctor that will spend the time with you. But, again, I make my patients read. I tell them, I can't spend an hour with you, holding your hand and telling you every fact. You got to spend 2 weeks reading, do a bunch of research, and then I'll sit and talk to you for, 20, 30 minutes, and we'll kind of take our time and discuss it. So I'll do that with my patients, but most doctors won't. So people have to do it themselves.
Thank you for sharing so much information for that informed consent with so many people. Truly, it is heroic. What you're doing is heroic. It shouldn't have to be, but it is.
Yeah, and I can't not do it. I guess I feel responsible to do it. I can also add that I love doing it. I mean, for me are my favorite thing to talk about, and I can talk about it all day. I could never start learning about it, never stop learning about it, and never stop writing about it. And it fascinates me because I want to make sure people are equipped to make a decision that they feel is best for their child and their family, and they probably have to consider the community around them as well. But I think everyone has the right to make those choices.
Dr. Sears, where can people find your work?
I'd say my main spot is my website, drbobsears.com. I just was at drbobsears.com. It's a brand new website. I had a lot of fun creating it, and I have a lot of good resources on there. And but not just my resources. I mean, there's lots of other.
Highly recommend this, guys. It's an easy read. It's an easy read, and not that it's like light, but it's easy. It's a manual to understand what we're dealing with.
Yeah, and I've created a lot of other tools. I've created podcasts and videos. You don't have a month to spend going through a book. Spend 5 hours watching a video. Spend an hour watching another video. I mean, I've tried to create a lot of different resources that people could use that fits, how they learn. Because not everyone learns by reading very well. But you got to find a way to do your homework so that you make an educated decision.
I have one last question.
Okay.
If theoretically people just cold turkey stopped the childhood schedule, stopped doing the childhood schedule from the CDC, and pretty much no one, unless they were traveling to a third world country with their kids, was getting the vaccine on that schedule, what would you, if you can, theorize about what disease would look like over the next 2 decades?
I would say we would see chickenpox come back like it used to. We would definitely start to see measles. We would probably, those are the 2 of the main vaccines that do kind of help keep these diseases out of our country. We would not see polio come back. Whooping cough wouldn't change because that doesn't help. The flu wouldn't change. COVID wouldn't change. What else? We don't have diphtheria. It wouldn't come back because diphtheria is a disease of poor sanitation. I don't think, probably wouldn't see much tetanus come back. We would see a few things come back, but none of the scourges that killed everyone left and right, of 100 years ago and 50 years ago. I feel like we would have to deal with it, and we deal with it as a society. But the question is, and I guess my challenge to listeners, like if you're a doctor listening to this, or if you are someone who is in favor of mandated vaccines and you're listening to this, my challenge to you is, I feel like we have to answer the question of which kids are healthier, those who grow up without vaccines or those who grow up with the CDC schedule. So far, it hasn't been researched.
Wow.
In a large way.
It has not been researched.
There's been small studies. Every small study that's been done shows that the unvaccinated kids are healthier.
Wow. The unvaccinated kids are
But they're
healthier.
not good enough studies to make a conclusion.
Wow.
So my challenge to the medical community listening to this is do that study. Take 100,000 kids and do the CDC schedule on half of them because the parents want to, and don't do things on the big group of parents who voluntarily decide that they want to opt out of it. Study those kids for the next 20 years. See if maybe there's no difference. Maybe we're all the same. Maybe the kids end up way healthier. But what if we find that the unvaccinated kids are the ones that are way healthier? I'm shocked that we haven't done that research. And our government asked the CDC to do that research 10 years ago, and the CDC said, no, thank you.
Wow.
I bet we'll see this government ask the CDC again to do that research. And I bet there will be people at the CDC or the NIH or somewhere who will begin this kind of research project so that 20 years from now, we can answer this question.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Sears. Grateful for you and your work.
Well, thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Lila Rose Show. And thanks again to Dr. Sears for joining us. Thanks so much. And also don't forget to be subscribed wherever you're listening to the show. We'll see you guys next time. A huge thank you to our partner, EWTN. EWTN is the largest religious network reaching millions of people with the truth of the faith, entertainment, and news. Check them out at EWTN.com.